As some of you might have heard, we're actually going to be starting something new at Ivan Rest Church this fall, which is actually also old. A number of years ago, Ivan Rest started a small group ministry called Life Groups. Now, for a whole number of different reasons over the last couple of years, that ministry has kind of died off to some degree. Some of you are certainly still in life groups, but certainly many members in our church are not members of life groups. Now, part of that had to do with COVID. We had quite a few more life groups that were part of our church before COVID. But then during COVID, some of those groups couldn't meet, some still did on Zoom, some sort of took a break, fully intending to get back together after the pandemic, and some of those groups did get back together after the pandemic, while some of them did not. Now, in our staff and our council, we've come to the conclusion that rebuilding a small group structure like that is going to be crucially important for the discipleship of our church, for all of us growing as disciples of Jesus Christ going forward. And so we've made the decision to restart a small group sort of structure at Ivan Rest. Now, if you're already part of a small group, don't worry, you can stay in the same group if you choose, but we're going to be moving forward with what we're now calling table groups. So we actually have you here in the Hahn family house at our kitchen table to explain what these groups are all going to be about. So rather than using a name like small groups or life groups, which is the name we used to use for our small group structure at Ivan Rest, we're instead choosing this to be the symbol and name for these groups. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. First, we see a lot of biblical significance around the table. Throughout Scripture, you see God's people meet together at a table, share meals. It's actually in the Old Testament part of how people would have come together and cut a covenant, it's called, formed a covenant with each other. Well, we see a lot of the significance of the table in the New Testament as well. For instance, Jesus often met with people and with his disciples at a table. It seems to be one of the primary places or ways that he would do discipleship or teaching and forming people into being his disciples. We also see Jesus reveal himself in some very profound ways at the table. For instance, the last night of Jesus' life here on earth before his crucifixion, he gathered with his disciples at a table. And that's where he actually gave us one of the sacraments that we still practice to this day. What do we call it? The table of the Lord, the Lord's Supper, where Jesus sat with his disciples at table, broke bread with them, poured and shared wine with them to symbolize his own sacrifice. The bread was his body, the wine was his blood, and it symbolized and enacted the gospel story. And so there's this profound connection of the table to Jesus and him teaching his disciples about who he is and what he was all about. Then after his resurrection, in Luke chapter 24, Jesus actually appears to a couple of disciples on the road to Emmaus. Now, they don't recognize who he is at first because there's something different and new about his post-resurrection body. But when they finally get to the city, Jesus sits down at a table with them. He breaks bread. He blesses it, and that's when they recognize who he is. And so we see this symbol and something profound and sacred and holy about the table throughout Scripture as a primary means for Jesus to do discipleship with his disciples, forming and shaping them into people who follow after him. And we believe that in the same way, Jesus still does that work with us as his disciples today when we gather around a table. As Jesus himself says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them. And one of the primary ways that we still gather as Christian believers is at the table. So, what will these table groups look like? First of all, we're going to have sign-ups throughout the second part of summer and into the fall, where those of you who are interested in joining a small group, a table group, can sign up for those groups. And then starting in the fall, we'll begin meeting in our table groups. The way that will look will probably look a little different depending on your group and how you decide you want it to go. Certainly you can meet around the table for a full meal together. There's something beautiful and wonderful about breaking bread together as Christian disciples and sharing a full meal. And in the groups that we've been piloting and test running this structure with, that's kind of how we've been operating. You could choose, though, instead to simply do appetizers and maybe some drinks or dessert, something like that. But we do see the table as being a crucial component of these groups to form community, to gather us together, for us to have a shared experience as Christian brothers and sisters and friends. After the table time, groups will then shift to some sort of study. Now this will look different at different times. We are planning to do some all-group studies, as we're calling them, where everyone in the church will all be studying the same things. And those will take different forms over the next number of years. In between those all-group studies, your groups will have the freedom to choose to study whatever you want. So you could do a Bible study, study a book of the Bible. You could do a book study and study a book by some sort of Christian author. A video curriculum. You could do service times where your whole group decides to go out and serve together at some local service opportunity or nonprofit here in our area. You could have times of worship. If somebody's really musically gifted, could lead you in a hymn sing or something like that, or a time of prayer. It can take different forms. To start, what we're actually going to be doing for the first 3 years of table groups is a spiritual discipline curriculum called Practicing the Way. This comes out of a church in Portland, Oregon, where a pastor named John Mark Comer for 5 years taught at his church about the spiritual disciplines. And just a year or two ago, he felt God's call actually leading him out of ministry in that church to then take that material around the spiritual disciplines, so things like Sabbath and silence and solitude and prayer and fasting and all the rest, and develop them into a standalone curriculum that could be done in any church. And so that's what they've been doing for the last 2 years. They've gathered a creative team together, and they've been coming up with this curriculum around the spiritual disciplines. And that's actually what we're going to be launching in the fall. For the next 3 years, we're going to be going through the 9 spiritual disciplines that they're doing and practicing the way. Now again, there will be gaps between the times that we're focusing on one of those disciplines, so you'll have some freedom to do different things that your group would like to. But at least to start, we're going to be spending 4 weeks at a time on a number of the historic Christian disciplines, and we'll be giving more details about that a little later. So that's kind of our plan for this fall, is to relaunch actually something that is both old and kind of new at Ivanrest, and then to be focusing specifically on the spiritual disciplines in the table groups that we're going to be forming. So we're excited about this. We see this as a primary vehicle for pursuing Christian discipleship together going forward at Ivanrest, and we would certainly invite you to join us at the table.